Hello everyone, my name is Loko and welcome to some more StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void. Now recently I made a video where I very quickly mentioned that hey, I think that Zerg vs Protoss is currently my favorite matchup because it's very dynamic and literally every single Zerg unit can be played. And I mentioned that very briefly and I had a lot of people, comment on that being like, hey, What do I actually do in Zerg vs Protoss? Like, what's the goal for ZVP? I feel lost. Because every single time I go for, Hydralisk, my opponent seems to be going for Disruptors and I lose everything. Every single time I go for Roaches, my opponent just has a couple of Void Rays out and he's gonna deal with me that way. Every single time I go Mutalisk, my opponent is already having Phoenixes out and I just get rolled that way. And I can very quickly, or I can very easily understand exactly the frustrations that you're coming from. Because honestly, for me, I had the exact same thing when I was first starting off in Legacy of the Void. Especially the addition of the Adept and then obviously also the addition of the Disruptor made it very difficult to decide what kind of army composition I wanted to be going for. Now in this specific game that you see on the screen right now, it's a pretty solid example game of the different kinds of tech switches that you can be going for. However, I want to mostly just use this as background noise and I want to be talking maybe a little bit about the game later on as well, but I mostly want to be discussing the different kinds of units that you should be making versus Protoss, the transitions that you should be going for, depending on what you scout. So, Zerg in general is a very reactive and very responsive race. Most of the time, you're gonna be the one that will be scouting out what the opponent is doing and then responding accordingly. Now, currently in Zerg vs Protoss, literally every single Zerg unit is used with the exception of maybe the Swarm Host. But other than that, literally all of the units that Zerg has do have their place and do have their, their move in this matchup, depending once again on what the opponent is going for. Now, normally, whenever a Protoss player goes for any kind of tech path, they sort of commit to that tech path, and that is a very important thing to understand. It feels like a lot of Zerg players, especially that I coach, especially, I would say up to about Diamond League, maybe Platinum League, don't actually realize that if a Protoss player is going for Stargate units, the chance of him actually also having something like Blink Stalkers out is very small, especially if he's on 2 bases. Or, for example, if he's going for robotics units, the fact that he could also have Void Rays is extremely small, because he just simply doesn't have the economy to really support that. And that is one of the main important things to realize whenever you scout a Protoss players. There are obviously a couple of builds where they go Stargate into robotics, however, I want to mostly disregard that, but for the most part, you gotta keep in mind that if a Protoss player commits to a certain tech path, they are usually stuck in that exact tech path. So in this specific game, we're watching right here on the screen, as you can see, my opponent is going for a Stargate. And scouting is very, very, very important. Early game compositions for Zerg would normally be something like Zerglings in combinations with Roaches and Ravagers. And I would actually put the emphasis on Zerglings. Zerglings are very, very powerful, mostly because they will be able to carry you from the beginning to the game to the very late part of the game. Now, obviously, the Protoss player could be going for a counter to Zerglings, right? Such as, for example, Adepts, such as Zealots, such as Archons. And at that point, that is where the Roaches and the Ravagers come in. So early game compositions, I would say go for a maximum of maybe 10 Roaches early on, especially if you don't have that big of an economy, and then follow it up with as many Zerglings as you possibly can while researching melee upgrades. So early game compositions, Roaches, Ravagers, and Zerglings, with the majority of the units being Zerglings. Now, one of the most important things while I pause this replay really quickly is this Overlord Scout right here. I would recommend scouting between 3 and 4 minutes to figure out what the Protoss player is going for. In this specific case, I see him going for an Oracle right here. You can see that building in the starport, right? And I know right now, okay, I need to make Spore Crawlers and I can drone up. Now, let's say I wouldn't have scouted anything right here. I would have simply responded with Ravagers and Zerglings, Spore Crawlers blindly at 4 minutes, which is completely acceptable. Blind Spore Crawlers at 4 minutes, just to blind counter any kind of potential Stargate play, but also to blind counter any kind of, for example, Dark Templar play. So early game compositions, Zerglings and Roaches. Now that I've scouted that my opponent is going for a Stargate, I can switch up my build a little bit. I can go for different kinds of strategies. But for the most part, Zerglings, Ravagers is where it's at in the early part of the game with a scouting Overlord. And if you don't see anything, or you're not scouting, or you're forgetting scouting, or you've gotten spawn locations where you're not able to get a Overlord inside of your opponent's main base, make Spore Crawlers blindly at 4 minutes. Now, in the meantime, I'm just simply making a lot of drones. I'm making sure that I get a big economy going right here, and I'm gonna be following it up with a bunch of gases, and I'm gonna be transitioning towards a lair. Now, this specific game, I'm not gonna really be talking about, you know, tech pads and the timings on the gases and the timings on the drones and all that shenanigans, but just realize that early on, we just got a couple of Zerglings. I've been focusing on getting a massive economy out, and I will try and squeeze out as many workers as I possibly can off of Zerglings, Roaches, and Ravagers. Now, in the middle part of the game is where the things become a little bit more interesting. For example, one of the compositions that you will see out of a Protoss player is going to be something like heavy robotics units. That means Immortals, that means, no, I would say Colossus, but Colossus are very uncommon. Mostly it's going to be Immortals and then Disruptor play as well. Disruptors are extremely good, and one of the greatest units that you can go against those kind of units is something like a Lurker. So you would be switching into a Hydra then, with Zerglings to support it, and then obviously also add on the Lurkers. Now, because the Lurker damage is so high to begin with, if your opponent is for a ground-based army, you don't really need to go ahead and play, you know, a very aggressive style with your own units either. Like, you don't really need to get the upgrades for the missile out for the Lurkers, just because their base damage is extremely high. And the reasoning why I'm going for the double evolution chambers right now is to start the upgrades for the Zerglings. Now, the Zergling upgrades may be a little bit surprising, maybe a little bit confusing, because in Heart of the Swarm, you would always be focusing on Roaches and then maybe into Hydras later on. And you hear me mention it right now as well, right? Roaches and Hydralisk. But here's the reason. So, late game Zerg got buffed significantly in Legacy of the Void. First off, Ultralisk got a lot more armor. They are a lot beefier and they benefit from melee upgrades. Brute Lords, throw Brutelings at your opponent. The Brutelings benefit from melee upgrades, but most importantly, the Zerglings now have an Adrenal Glands upgrade that is actually increasing that damage from 18% in Heart of the Swarm to 40% currently, and they're gonna reduce that a little to 30% in the upcoming patch. But either way, Zerglings are able to carry you from the beginning of the game to the later part of the game, but most importantly, the army composition that I just described, be it Zerglings, be it Ultralisk, be it Brute Lords, are very good against ground-based armies once again. And if your opponent is going for heavy air, you can go ahead and just simply counterattack with all the units that you're creating. So, most of the time, you want to be focusing on melee upgrades for the simple reasoning that if your opponent is going for, say, robotics units, say, gateway units, Ultra Ling, Brute Lord kind of armies will absolutely demolish that. But most importantly, Disruptors are very expensive to make from your opponent, and Zerglings just counter those. I mean, think about it. Disruptors do bonus damage to, or do splash damage to clumps of units, right? If you have Ravagers and Zerglings, I mean, as long as you split reasonably well with your Ravagers, your Zerglings will be able to get into your opponent anyway. So, most of the time, a ground-based upgrade focus path is very good with the melee upgrades and the carry-based upgrades as well. Oftentimes, you actually do want to go for a single Evo chamber. This time around, I am going to, you know, go for double upgrades just because I wanted to give that a try as well. Now, besides the Hydralisk switch, while I unpause the game again, besides the Hydralisk switch, there are definitely other options available as well. In this specific game, actually, I decide not to go for the Hydralisk change because I already see that my opponent is going for a Stargate. And if I know my opponent is going for Phoenixes, I could technically go for Hydralisk, but I find one thing to be significantly better in Legacy of the Void, and this is sort of unheard of in Heart of the Swarm, and that is to go for a Spire. I'm already getting the Spire up right now behind the mineral line in the main base, and this is not for Mutalisk. Mutalisk are absolutely terrible against Phoenixes, as you may be fully aware. But the reasoning why I'm getting them is Corruptors. And Corruptors are extremely good in Legacy of the Void. Basically, what they can now do is actually hit ground units. And since I know fully well that my opponent is committing to a lot of air units here, he's creating even a second starport as well. Why I don't know about that, I know that it's a viable switch for him. I know at this point that he has already committed a lot of resources in getting this, you know, air-based army out, so I don't really have to worry about my opponent also going for, let's say, Immortals. I know that that is going to be very difficult for him to pull off, simply because he does not have the economy really to support that. Now, he just now got a third base up, so he may be able to transition to something like that, but for the most part, right now, I don't need to be worried about a 2 or a 3 base all-in, where my opponent is going to have, you know, both a lot of Phoenixes and then also like 6 Immortals. It's just not gonna be happening. So what I'm actually focusing on right here is a Corruptor-based army, and Corruptors are great for multiple reasons. First off, they can now attack ground, so you can actually kill buildings with them, which you will see very shortly in this game as well. And they can now also go ahead and actually deal with things like War Prison play very well. They can deal with Phoenixes obviously very well. They can deal with carrier switches very well, and they can deal with Void Rays relatively well if your opponent is indeed going for those. Now, one important thing to notice about the Void Rays, and whenever you go for a Spire, is to also get the Carapace upgrade. Carapace upgrade in both Zerg vs Terran and Zerg vs Protoss is far superior to the attack upgrade, simply because the Corruptors will stay alive a lot longer. And if you indeed do end up switching to Brute Lords, they're obviously also going to be benefiting from those upgrades more than they would be from the melee upgrades. So I'm not going for any kind of Mutalisk spray right here. I'm going to be going for Corruptors instead. Now, in this specific game, you can already see on the mini-map or on the production tab right here that my opponent is indeed going for more and more Void Rays. But either way, these Corruptors are going to be useful. Now, obviously, this is only because I know that my opponent was going for the Stargate. Let's say I would have scouted right here that my opponent was going for robotics and I didn't see oracles come in and I didn't see phoenixes. I simply would have transitioned towards the Hydralisk and the Lurker. But in this specific game, I know my opponent is Stargate, which happens in about 50% of the game, and I feel like the Corruptor switch is great. Now, I usually end up going for right around 10 Corruptors or so if I see my opponent going for phoenixes. Like I mentioned, the phoenixes or the Corruptors are gonna be great to deal with any kind of, you know, air-based army, but most importantly, especially the people that I face that are not in Grandmaster League fall for this every single time. You can usually find one vulnerable base. So what I'm gonna use the Corruptors for in this specific game is to actually kill his natural. And we'll be able to do a ton of damage to that really quickly. Now, since I'm spending all of my gas on getting the upgrades out and making sure that I can go ahead and get Corruptors going, I can spend the majority of my minerals on either Zerglings or an extra base or just simply more workers. Now, since I do have this build already, or since I already have a relatively strong army at this point and I already feel pretty safe, I don't really need to attack into the Protoss player. Most of the time, you can actually go ahead and max out with a Zerg force with Hive units and just simply beat your opponent that way. Now, we've pretty much discussed most of these units already, right? Roaches have their place in the early game, Ravagers are great as well. Zerglings are going to be able to carry you throughout the entirety of the game, but most of the time you're going to be using those early on in combination with the Roaches. Hydras I will be using to switch into kind of any kind of potential Lurker play, and I would use this mostly against you know, ground-based armies out of the robotics facility. Mutalisks are okay if you can get a whole bunch of them out, and they're great for like tech switches, but I wouldn't really base your army around them too much. Corruptors are good if your opponent is going for air-based armies like we see in this one. And then we have Infestors, Swarmhost, Vipers, and obviously also the Ultralisk. Now, Infestors have a couple of uses. You can use them to lock down your opponent. If you're anywhere below Master League, I would not recommend going for Infestors, simply because they need a lot of babysitting and they're hard to use. Swarmhost, I would say don't touch them also if you are not going for any specific strategies. You don't really need to. Now, the other units that we also still need to discuss is going to be units such as the Baneling, and then also units such as the Brute Lord right now. And then obviously Ultras as well. So, late game Zerg vs Protoss should actually consist of a lot of Brute Lords and then also a lot of Ultralisk. You do want to go for a relatively quick Hive after you get, you know, a relatively strong mid game going. And here, by the way, you can see this aggression happening. But you do want to go for a relatively quick Hive after you realize what is going on with your opponent. Once you know that it's safe to tech up, it's usually going to be worth to tech up straight to Hive and actually go for usually Ultralisk first and then a Brute Lord switch afterwards. Or if you already have the Corruptors out like I do in this game, you can go for the Brute Lord switch first and then switch to Corruptors. Now, the other unit that is also pretty powerful in Zerg vs Protoss, and that is very scoutable, I suppose, is going to be the Baneling. Banelings are extremely good if your opponent is indeed going for a ground-based army that it seems to be focused a lot around the Zealot, and you're usually scouting around for those. If you see your opponent going for a heavy amount of Zealots, switching into a couple of Banelings while transitioning towards a Hive to get Ultras and Brute Lords out once again is extremely good. So once again, to recap, early game, Ravagers and Zerglings. I think I emphasized that plenty. You want to be scouting early on to try and figure out what your opponent's unit's composition is gonna be like. Either way, if you don't scout anything, get Spore Crawlers in each and every one of your bases at the 4-minute mark to figure out or to counter any kind of Dark Templar play, but also to counter, more importantly, Oracle type play and then into Stargate. If you know your opponent is going Stargate, adding on Corruptors is great. I would stop at around 10 or so, unless you know your opponent is focusing on a really heavy air-based army. And if your opponent is going for a ground-based army, switching towards Hydralisk and Lurker is very, very powerful. Hive switches as soon as you can or as soon as you feel comfortable doing so. Most of the time that is going to be when you know your opponent is also attacking up at that point in time. Now in this specific game, I have analyzed, hey, there were Corruptor or there were Void Rays out, there were a heck of a lot of Phoenixes out, there's already a massive amount of Stargate. I should be focusing on countering an air-based army completely. And that is the point where you can see me start producing a lot more Queens as well. Queens are one of those underrated units, and you know, they're extremely good at killing stuff. Right now I'm still focusing on Zerglings, once again, because they don't cost me any minerals and I need to focus on as much gas as possible just because I'm going for, you know, a relatively quick Hive here. And I do want to make sure that I'm focusing on a lot of Corruptors to deal with any kind of potential airplay. But I'm getting the armor upgrades on the Corruptors, getting a lot of Queens here to kill his air-based army. Now I still have a lot of Zerglings out on the floor as well, or on the ground, that I should be upgrading right now with the Adrenal Glands. Haven't quite done that yet, but I'm trying to figure out what is going on right now for my opponent. So a Queen switch is great against airplay. Queens are extremely good with, for example, Brute Lords. Queens are very powerful in combination with Ultralisk. Queens are pretty much always extremprismally good if you can get them out in big numbers and you get enough energy on them in order to actually, you know, snipe down the Protoss unit. So right now I'm triggering the prismatic alignment right there on the Void Rays, immediately backing off, marching forward with the Queens, producing 14 more Corruptors just to try and do damage to my opponent, transfusing as many of these units as possible, and now we're just gonna start shoving the army forward. So in this specific example, it's a very clean game and I'm just basically left alone to what I want to do. And this is actually it's most of the time true for every single game. Although I know very well that if you're playing a match, it can feel extremely overwhelming to decide what you want to be going for on the fly. And that is totally acceptable, okay? Whenever you are feeling like that, just simply take a look at the replay and go from there. Try and figure out what you could have improved upon. Pretty much every single unit is viable right now from Zerg, so simply go ahead, watch the replay, think about what unit would have been great, and think about the ways you could have been able to get that one out. I'm not saying that I got Zerg vs Protoss figured out completely yet. There's definitely all kinds of things that catch me off guard as well, but I would say thinking about it clearly and trying to counter your opponent's army correctly is extremely powerful. I hope you guys found this video helpful. Let me know down below the like button in the comment section if you would like me to make one of those types of videos for every single matchup, because I would love to talk about StarCraft. I'm kind of a nerd, I love playing this game, but I'm never completely sure if you guys love hearing this heavy strategy type talk. Anyways, I want to thank you all for watching. Have an amazing day. Do not forget to smile, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!